This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, special guest Ilana Bondell asks us about the privilege of Goblin Mode, and Joey asks us about all of these new pathologies.
Woo!
Insert file of Joey singing Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and late 90s pop grunge band singer Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
And this is what a special guest and mother of the persnicket, Ilana Bondell, sounds like.
Hi, Ilana puts her head into her hand.
Hi, this is Ilana.
Was that an annoying qualifier? What do we call this?
No, it was great. It just, yeah, it's great.
I feel like you are the mother of the persnicket.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
You can't make eye contact with me over the screen. I've ruined the show already. The reason why I reeled myself back in is because you're in LA, and I think of the song Goo Goo Dolls' Iris from the movie City of Angels with, is it Meg Ryan and Nicolas Cage? Even though I don't know if I've seen the movie, but the music video was like all scenes from that movie. Anyways, I'm old.
Wow, what
I guess is the
selection of thoughts.
Thank you for
Train
sharing.
of thought.
Jess, do we have any housekeeping?
Same.
It's all
Same
clean.
things.
We're good. No corrections. If you have corrections for us, corrections department is criticalnonsense@sylvain.co, or you can go to thisisnonsense.com. There's a little doobly-doo, as Aaron says. There's like a form submission. Send us your corrections. I mean, we're rarely wrong, I think, but that's
We're wrong
absolutely not
so
true.
Often.
Yeah.
We are constantly wrong.
We're wrong so much it would be a full-time job to be our fact checkers. Great. Ilana, you have some things to talk to us about.
I sure do.
How persnickety, on a scale of persnickety, where do they land?
1 to persnickety.
I would say I'm definitely at a 200. So let's go.
Whoa.
Let's go. Okay.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
So
So
it went that high.
I know that Critical Nonsense covered this recently, but just for the uninitiated, I will provide a little context that last month, an article in New York Magazine's The Cut went viral called "A Vibe Shift is Coming." Subtitle, "Will Any of Us Survive It?" And this was an article by Allison Davis that went viral and basically was describing a shift in cultural movement that is thought to be on the horizon. Coined the term itself, vibe shift, coined by Sean Monahan from K-Hole. But the idea that whereas in the past, early aughts, maybe the vibe was hipster indie, peak Arcade Fire, Williamsburg hipsters, and then came the 2010s of what they call the Blood Orange era, normcore, Kinfolk the Club, and then came the hypebeast woke era that we're just coming out of now. Question being, what is the next vibe shift? Off the heels of this month, an article came out in The Guardian, of all places, that was recently the talk.
The Guardian has some great articles sometimes. Not always,
Yeah.
but sometimes
As
they
we're
have some good
seeing.
ones.
But
As we are seeing here.
this piece was shared around among some Sylvainers and hotly debated. And this piece in The Guardian by someone named Carrie Paul that came out this week is titled "Slobbing Out and Giving Up, why are so many people going goblin mode?" The vibe shift context being there because the thought is that maybe goblin mode is the vibe, the new vibe that we're shifting towards. I think we can debate that unto itself, but I'm here to talk about goblin mode And let me give a quick snippet from the article that sums it up. The term goblin mode embraces the comforts of depravity, spending the day in bed watching 90 Day Fiancé on mute while scrolling endlessly through social media, pouring the end of a bag of chips in your mouth, downing Eggo toaster oven waffles with hot sauce over the sink because you can't be bothered to put them on a plate, leaving the house in your pajamas and socks only to get a single Diet Coke from the bodega. It's basically the idea of giving into this sort of the most base creature-like form of yourself, hence the name Goblin Mode. So my question to discuss today is Goblin Mode a privilege?
I mean, I think it depends on... It could absolutely be a privilege, right? The sort of, if you're in a situation, whether it's you have enough money or enough comfort or enough social status to not feel judged when you're leaving your home, or that you need to put on a face in order to ascend, some sort of social or professional ladder or whatever. But I think it could just as easily be, some people have been living goblin mode their whole life, and this is not a new thing. This is not a new thing, right? Like, slobs have existed forever, and go, Jess.
Well, and maybe wrapped up in this is that, like, even the concept and the construct of goblin mode has many variations and interpretations. Like, in this article, it links to some of the earliest internet mentions of goblin mode. One coming from a Reddit thread where someone posted in something like 2009, I think it said, someone to the confessions thread being like, I like to creep around my home and act like a goblin. I don't know why, but I just enjoy doing this. I'll carry around a sack and creep around sort of in a crouching position, making goblin noises, and I'll walk around my house and pick up different trinkets and put them in my bag while saying stuff like, I'll be having that, and laughing maniacally in my goblin voice. And I just think, like, this just feels like a totally different, totally unrelated to privilege and culture today. Like, this origin of goblin mode feels like the purest expression of people's weirdness. And I feel like the vibe shift style goblin mode is totally a distorted interpretation of goblining that is much more, I don't know, maybe it's tied to just like pandemic driven nihilism, or maybe, right, it's sort of like the backwards pendulum swing to this very like highly curated image that people present, and now is sort of like the opposite and exaggeratedly sort of refined, disheveled presentation of themselves. I don't know. It feels like this new version of goblin is less appealing, and maybe is the source of your question, Ilana.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that those really early origins of goblin mode speak to this idea that, like, of course people do things in private that are just weird and indulgent, and that unto itself, I think, is just like pretty natural human behavior.
Exactly.
I mentioned when we were talking about it with some people from the office that, like, it also instantly reminded me of season 4 Sex and the City, when Carrie Bradshaw has her very ill-fated move-in with her boyfriend Aiden, and is going crazy because all of a sudden she's like constantly in her space and she feels like she has no freedom to do these things. And she kind of confides in the ladies that, my SSBs, the secret single behaviors, we all have them. And it's like the things you like to do behind closed doors when no one's watching. And so annoyingly, her SSB is standing up in the kitchen, eating crackers and jam and reading Vogue at the counter. And it's like, that is not a good secret single behavior, but okay, Carrie. But yeah, like, we've all had versions of that forever, but I think, and so we can talk about that, but I think specifically I'm reacting to the very like TikTok oriented version of goblin mode, where it's just like so many modes of screens happening at once, not giving a shit about where you have to be, what you look like. And also that too is natural. Like my brother, who is not entrenched in TikTok or any of this, with his best friend just calls it your POS days. Like when you just like need to lie in bed and be a POS and not apologize for it. But I can't help but wonder if that is something that is much more accessible when you're at a certain life stage and at a certain level of confidence, because you don't feel like you need to prove yourself to people, because I think Goblin Mode suggests an extreme level of comfort in your most base form of who you are. And especially in this TikTok version of it, then potentially being able to laugh at that and broadcast it to others. And I wonder for people who feel like, for anyone who feels like they need to sort of fight for their place in society or fight for respect, I would imagine that going Goblin Mode is not something that feels so comfortable to broadcast.
Well, I think, some of this too feels like, the pandemic nihilism point that you brought up, Jess, right? Like they in the article, they start off with Goblin Mode as like a comparison on like a polar opposite to the cottagecore world that people were into, I guess, at the beginning of the pandemic. I heard this, but it definitely completely missed me. But the idea of thinking about Goblin Mode within the context of the other social norms that are being reevaluated and sort of like societal structures that are being reevaluated, I think is interesting, right? If you think about like the 4 years pre-pandemic, maybe I'm guessing, right? Like the volume of sort of wellness content and, like the goop type of vibe of the world of like, you need to be so intentional and thoughtful about like everything that you wear, about all the ways that you present yourself, of everything you put in your body, everything you put on your body, right? Like this sort of like aspirational reaching for some like platonic form of yourself, or living a life in some sort of platonic form of yourself and projecting a world that looks better than your actual life is. This feels like not just coming back and saying like I don't care what other people think about me. It's like, oh, like I'm gonna go further in the other direction and like fill myself with like hot garbage and present myself in weird ways. But there's also there's like, I'm thinking about, right, there was recently like photos of is it Zendaya or Zendaya? I know one of them is right and one of them is wrong, but I'm
the first one.
Zendaya is the right one. Got it.
I believe so.
I hear people. No, it's Zendaya.
Alex Cantel says that's wrong. Are you sure?
Right.
Zendaya? Maybe. I know it is one of those.
I think her friends call her Z, so you can just call her Z.
Got it. All right. Well, so there's photos of Z.
Thank goodness
online,
we have you here.
Like in, just like grungy mismatching sweats and stuff like that, which like everyone has and everyone wears. And in some ways, this feels not like it has the potential to just be that like vibe shift of like an aesthetic shift, because it's being sort of like mimetically distributed. Like I think my goblin lives pretty out in the open. Like if I dropped a piece of candy on the ground, I'm gonna eat it. Like I'm like, will eat with my hand. I'll do a lot of those things, but not all of those things that were presented, right? Like everybody's got a little bit of goblin in them. It's just a question of like, are you trying to now just project your weird things out in the world as a demonstration of like being on trend?
Point of order. It is Zendaya, not Zendaya like papaya, as some people like to assume. It is definitely Zendaya. So Alex, tell all your friends.
I got it right the first time, but was not positive. So
was not confident enough.
Yeah,
for sure.
But like Ilana, like is this my question is like, are people actually like doing these things, or do you do them just to be like on the trend, right? Like insofar as everyone's got a little bit, you know?
I think people would be doing it anyway, to the point of the earlier commentary that part of this is just like what it's almost too natural to even try and create like a cultural movement around, because to your point, everybody has a little bit of goblin in them. But I disagree that it's as simplistic as like, are you just going to capitalize on this trend by choosing to broadcast it or not? Because that is my point, is that I think there's privilege, or whatever we want to call it, wrapped up in the comfort of being able to broadcast it. For example, even some of the things you're talking about, as a woman, for a million obvious and maybe not so obvious reasons that we could unpack, I don't necessarily feel comfortable being a goblin at the office, for example, like even in front of people that I know and love. And, you know, I was just talking about this with someone, the whole return to office and reckoning with like having to wear pants with buttons and a zipper again, instead of just like wearing my sweats. And no one's telling me that I can't wear comfy clothes to the office, but I feel an immense pressure and obligation to be a more polished version of myself. And I would venture to guess that there's a lot of like identity politics wrapped up in that.
And so begets the question of what becomes of this goblin positivity. You know, is it just going to put pressure on people who cannot succumb to their goblinish desires and just make them feel sad that they can't do those things? Or is it like some kind of active righteous defiance to be like, everyone should feel free to be their most goblin self? Or maybe to the third extreme, it's like, again, over-exaggerating certain things because it's sort of a theatrical performance of eccentricity or uniqueness. And I think it is fair to presume that in a world revolving around Goblin Mode, those two poles are actually pretty realistic of a threat, even if the middle lane is how it's being presented.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me to think about it as a privilege. Like we have, you know, some folks who are like more goblin-y and less goblin-y at the company, or like in our own friend groups or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think like there are goblin-y people like senior at our company and junior, like, and so it makes me think about, you know, even if you go to the like grocery store, right? Like you'll see a spectrum of those things. And sometimes it's people who are like, you know, especially if it's like a neighborhood spot where you go often, you've seen them out of Goblin Mode and you see them in Goblin Mode. And so some of this makes me just think about your personal tolerances with regard to goblining versus other people's tolerances with goblining, right? Like totally. You grew up in the city, like, you know, in the city being New York City, like, and sort of an era of more presentation. And so like, how much of this is a product of privilege versus like an individual preference, whether or not it's a desired preference?
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe it might be also fair to clarify that like maybe New York City is a comfortable place to filter or not filter as you choose, because that is like the culture of the city, is like do whatever the heck you want. But at least if I'm hearing you right, Ilana, that is not true of many other places. That if goblin is another word for just being comfortable not filtering yourself, yeah, there are not all places is such a thing possible.
Totally. And I think everything, Joey, you're saying is right. Definitely, just like personality is a big part of this too. But I do think it's both. And I also, when I say, you know, the word privilege has so much baggage associated with it. But also what I mean is even the privilege of like not having dependence, which is part of what I was curious to pick your brain on, Joey. I feel like you read this and it feels very much like a product of the TikTok generation, that when you have a kid that needs to be taken care of, suddenly your whole day is structured around that. And you like literally don't really have the ability to do most of what's described in this article.
Do the sweatpants, go get a Diet Coke in your slippers, because ain't nobody got time for that.
When I first saw the byline that you had read at the beginning of this, when it was shared around, I was like, "Oh, that's so indulgent!" Like,
right.
And it was almost exclusively oriented around being able to be in bed all day. I was like, "Oh, that sounds glorious." But there's a flip side of it that is like forced goblin mode if you're making sacrifices, like on the weekend, particularly like where I have a increased uptick in childcare, and I'm making like sacrifices between like childcare versus doing something else. It's my child, but like for lack of a better term other than childcare, I'm like, well, maybe I don't shower on a Saturday because that's like I would rather sleep an extra 30 minutes or something, and so then I don't shower, so I'm more of a goblin already, and like the goblin piles up because of other responsibilities,
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think this also speaks to, again, like as at least as presented in this original article, that like goblin mode only works if it's a choice, and that you have to be able to like turn it off whenever you want, and that I'm choosing to spend my time in this way, which maybe like what you're describing is not you being a goblin, that's just you being a human being who's trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is it's, fine if the word privilege is too loaded, it's a luxury, it feels like, to be able to choose to indulge. A lot of it is laziness, like, and again, I don't mean that in the pejorative sense really, but it's like choosing to, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I don't like the word laziness, but it's very indulgent and luxurious.
You described it in the beginning as like, you said something about the primal nature, and it made me think about a lot about like the id or things like that, of just being like, what do I want? I want to not move. I want to whatever, like in the article, smoke a bowl by myself and see if I get scared or whatever they said.
Well, and this is the part that I feel like is interesting, is instead of like when you're talking about this as laziness, Ilana, to me, I feel like a way to grapple with this idea better as a vibe is to think about it as a strangely popular, culturally understood type of recreation, a new type of leisure that we all choose, where instead of for fun, wherever you are, a lot of people can choose this particular activity, which is being really weird. You have the time.
The funny part of this is like, the more I'm thinking about it, since you brought up like dependence, is like, as a parent, like a lot of these behaviors I do, like not by like eating something over the sink because you're trying to like stuff your face before like something happens, or like you're balancing between like wrangling a child and you're just like grab a Hawaiian roll, rip it open with your bare hands, stuff a chunk of turkey in it, and just eat it chasing after a toddler, right? Like some of the things that I do where I'm just like, oh, that's out of convenience. I'm realizing like, technically I'm a goblin. I'm a full-blown goblin.
But it's like practical in your case, right? So but also going back to the post-pandemic or pandemic influenced nature of all of this, I think the nihilism that you were talking about, Jess, is totally true. And I think they say somewhere in the article, it's kind of like, one, we realize like we're all gonna die, so who cares? And also like we've all gotten through this together. So
they said
who
we're
are we
all
kidding?
a garbage can with an expiration date.
Right. So yeah, I feel, to the recreation point, I mean, part of this is me just getting older, but I feel like even my friends who are most obsessed with like self-worth via busyness have a completely shifted sense of what is an acceptable capacity to try and accomplish in a week, like extracurricularly. And it's so much more normalized to want to just like hang on someone's couch. And again, I know part of that is just getting older. But I think it's true that this extends to just like a new style of recreation, which is great for those of us who love to relax.
Without zippers on our pants.
Exactly.
To recline.
Yes.
Without the top button.
I was just thinking about like feeling like your thoughts about like how you have to dress at work. And I was like, I feel like you were like totally fine during the pandemic of just like, this is a client day, this is not a client day. And no one was like, oh, Lana's, wearing this thing or
no, but that's my point is it's so wrapped up in unsaid societal norms. It's not something that anyone at Sylvain did. And it's not like it also does feel intrinsic. It's not like, oh God, like I actually want to look a certain way when I'm leading a client call versus just, I save my tie-dye for internal days.
I didn't want to call out the tie-dye.
Yeah. And that's fine. Like I made that choice. Nobody told me to do that. And same with The Office. I like want to feel put together, but if I really unpack it, that's coming from something deeper about, norms of how I was raised and all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jess, is the recreation our wrap-up corner? Is this Jess's Goblin Corner? Is there anything else to be said?
I'll be having this and I'll be having that. Honestly, I just think I just really resonate with the original Goblin construct. And I if anyone is feeling like you can't resonate with the most modern interpretation, if nothing else, I hope that you, listener, can really let your goblin flag fly in the comforts of your own home, if nowhere else.
Amen.
Get your sack, get your trinkets. It's goblin time. And we're back. Should I do my goblin voice again on air? No, you don't need that.
Do it.
Anyways, I had a question for y'all. It's about pathologies. I'm worried I'm gonna just start like falling into it and not being able to escape it.
Don't do it.
It's not really a god. It's just like a small.
It's not. It's like a small grandmother that lives inside of you. Like what is happening?
But a goblin grandmother. So there's been a slew of internet jokes lately in a lot of places, and it's like even been covered in like a few late night shows. They've made jokes, but a bunch of them have been around effectively like people pathologizing like every behavior in our lives. And to be completely honest, I think there's a version of this that's happening right now where people are saying like, does this thing happen to you? Like you have X disorder. Does this thing happen to you? You have Y disorder. And I think there's a version of it that is like really minimizing a lot of people who actually have those disorders, behaviors. But I don't want the conversation to be about like gatekeeping of like who does and who doesn't have X, Y, or Z condition and who gets to determine those things. Jess, go ahead.
I immediately thought about folks with celiac disease.
Me too.
Versus folks who identify as gluten intolerant. That was like immediately. And then like those who have, when you said like who actually have it, I think even that is a phrase that could be just divisive to some. Mm-hmm. But in an example like this, like some people have been diagnosed with a very specific medically identified phenomenon, and then other people have discovered a correlation of something, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
I think that's like an example of what you mean. right?
Yeah, I think like the example is like, someone will be like, I always forget my charger at home. I have ADHD. And then they're like, and when I forget my charger at home, it stresses me out. I have anxiety. Like that's sort of like the extreme version of this joke. But, it's gotten to the point that everyone is sort of perpetually talking about these pathologies, even if it's not a question of like gatekeeping who does and who doesn't have any of these conditions, which is a thing I'm very not interested in doing. The volume with which we're talking about it culturally has increased a lot. And in some ways you could feel like that's a good thing, but like it's to the point where, I shared a joke with everyone here. Someone made like a very elaborate graph at Sweet Stench on Twitter, which is like already a great handle. Yeah, and the tweet was, I was today years old when I learned that going to the bathroom is literally a response to collective anxiety. And they built a graph that says going to the bathroom is not normal. And it says like average number of urinations and bowel movements per day have like rapidly skyrocketed in like current history. And they put Pew Research Center attached to it. It looks like a semi-legitimate graph, and it's completely made up. It's just a joke. But the fact that like jokes like this are existing like a lot makes me wonder about this like behavior of sort of hyper analyzing everything that happens to us and pathologizing it to a point. And so my question to you is, how should we feel about pathologizing our behaviors?
I have so many thoughts about this. It is a very complex question and topic. I think there's so many roots to assess. Obviously, this is coming out of the WebMD generation in many ways, right? And it feels really good to be able to put a name on something, and it makes you feel like things aren't your fault and you're part of some bigger collective thing that's been studied and identified, and it's not in my head. And that can reach really damaging extremes, like I think you're alluding to. But I think there is also something so valuable in being seen. And even if it's not truly in the most sort of clinical presentation of how the thing might show up in the DSM or whatever. I was actually just listening to a podcast that was talking about like capital T trauma and lowercase t trauma and how they're both valid, and that it is helpful to realize they're not the same thing, but that both can completely cause issues and emotional damage for people. And I guess when I hear this question, and I know your point isn't really to cast judgment one way or the other, but I think an interesting sort of dichotomy or lens that immediately comes to my mind is like, well, is it more dangerous for people to over pathologize things and kind of in a way that it's almost like becoming a joke and whatever? Or realistically, are people at more risk, generally speaking, of repressing things such that this culture or movement ultimately will benefit people because it forces them to start to put names and words to things that would otherwise go repressed? I personally come from a school of thought where like chronic pain is rampant in America. And I've done like a lot of reading and learning about how I believe there's like a massive mind, body, and emotional connection to chronic pain. And I think a lot of it is because people repress lower T trauma because they don't think it's quote unquote legitimate enough to really be reckoned with. But there's a lot of danger that comes in that because then you experience the impact and dangers of it in different confusing ways later on where you've like lost touch of why you even might be feeling this way, why you might be having anxiety, and etc. So again, I know your question isn't about like taking sides, but I think overall there is something really valuable in creating an openness to put names to things, even if you're not presenting the most extreme version of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. And I mean, this is, I feel like, where maybe the middle ground folks, if there were a camp in that middle ground, would say there is a word for it, but it's just not as extreme as taking the pathologized term. It's just, doubt or fear, just like things you experience as opposed to something medicalized that needs to be treated in some kind of way, which again, I think it just depends on the thing. And the point that you're making about delegitimizing or people feeling that they have to, like that would be an issue, especially if it's something that then bubbles up later or has other negative side effects versus but the thing is maybe just a question on some things may just not it could be a very legitimate swell of a mass of people experiencing something and maybe just at such a low grade maybe it doesn't need to be made into such a big thing. I think that it's just it depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I can see all sides of this, and so I don't really know what to make of it. I think there's a dynamic and why a lot of the jokes exist is because it's used as a cudgel a lot online. Right? Like, oh, you don't know about this? You must not have grown up with X. Or, like it's used as a way of sort of making someone who is not in that moment contextually thinking of like all possible scenarios, right? Which is a thing we've talked about in the past. But I think, I've spoken, I know a handful of people who work in sort of like people roles at different companies across the country, and occasionally like they'll say something to me and I'm just like, well, that sounds intense, like the way in which people are sort of coming into them and like telling them that like as a employer they need to do X, Y, or Z thing for that person, that is like creating sort of pressure from this like pathologizing behavior. One person I had spoken to was talking about like a woman was coming to them and talking about like all of these different situations that they needed, and the person was like, do you like there's sort of this which might be like a generational dynamic, right, where it's
totally.
Like the sort of familiarity with these things and how to sort of respond, and like what some of the stuff where we're going into this pathologizing, like even if it is sort of, let's say like a legitimate, like someone has a legitimate medical condition that comes with X, Y, or Z things, but like the particular behaviors that are being highlighted are just like, that's life, like I forgot my keys. Like, yes, I have ADHD, and also like, you still need to have your keys when you leave your house, otherwise you can't get back in. And sort of like, I think that's where some of my questions of like, how far is too far when it's like, life has its ups and downs or has dynamics, and like, is pathologizing of something, creating an orientation where everything is a problem, right? In the way that in sort of like the victim mindset idea, I guess, of saying like, if I think about like, I do have ADHD. If I think about everything about my ADHD as like a bad pathology, it just makes me feel shittier about myself,
Right. Or it might make it feel uncurable. Like, oh, I've now identified or diagnosed the problem, and so it is, as opposed to identifying something that is more temporary in like your mental construct of the thing. Can you think about it as something that is more of a moment that can be changed somehow, maybe is less daunting. And again, I think probably for the camp who believes that pathologizing is not helpful, it's like, because maybe it will help you move past whatever it is if it is something that can be moved past.
Well, when Joey initially brought this up before the show, it's like, why are we pathologizing everything? The first thing I said was the Western medical industrial complex. And I know you laughed, Jess, but I wasn't kidding, that to be able to put a medical term on something and prescribed something and, prescribe a treatment path and medication and whatever around it, even if you're like just barely hitting the threshold of what is true clinical depression, for example, makes the system money. And from an individual point of view, it's a lot easier sometimes to just take a pill than do the work of unpacking why you might be feeling these feelings. And again, this is not to minimize depression. I'm just using that as it's true with so many of the things that I think you're talking about, Joey, that it is easier and more lucrative to put a medical term on something than to really unpack what might be causing it if it is not a true medical condition.
Or oversimplify. If at the very least, like, even if we're not explicitly talking about something that has like a specific course of treatment, just, how fixed are your options? Like in the same way that it is recommended that you get multiple opinions from doctors so that you can make sure that you have options in front of you, right? Like, I think it's sort of the same thing of, okay, we're now identifying that you have a problem, and therefore does that mean that there is only one way to address that problem?
Right.
I think that's, again, one of the potential traps of over pathologizing. You don't have it. It may paint a picture of you not having as much choice as you actually do.
Yeah. The thing that I think a lot of people who are sort of against this in a camp are pointing out is like sometimes it's just people putting a pathology on something to like excuse a shitty behavior, right? Like, I'm using ADHD because it gets used a lot in this sort of like pathologizing, like social media thing where it's like, oh no, I wasn't like texting you all day because I have ADHD and I forgot you existed. It's like, no, you're just being a shitty partner, right? Like this, like maybe you shouldn't be dating that person or whatever. Like, so using it as a way to be like, I wasn't, being in my top form, so I'm just gonna like, well, actually, I have this thing, and that's not true of all instances, but I think that's sort of where you see this like generational divide often, where like older folks, even just like Gen Xers compared to Gen Z, are like Gen Xers like, that's just life, like suck it up, and Gen Z is like, you need to like understand my life, and you are like a product of a system that didn't care for you or whatever, and they're just like not seeing each other in this dynamic.
100%. Try telling my parents you have anything wrong with you other than like an X-ray with a broken bone, and their response is to not believe you. Like, I totally grew up in a household that discouraged any kind of like nuanced mental health oriented anything. And I navigate this all the time in my own life to the point of like using it as a crutch a little bit, even things that aren't fully quote unquote pathologized in a medical sense, but even being like the culture around being introverted. I like self-identify all the time as like, well, I'm an introvert, and there's all these memes and things about like, and that's why I leave you on red and like don't respond for 17 hours to a text message, or need a day alone in bed in the dark when, going back to the Goblin Mode is like, is that actually just like being lazy, or is that because I'm quote unquote an introvert? And so I lean on it too. And also candidly in conversations at our own company and in culture about burnout, it's something that I'm really sensitive to, because I think I'm really self-conscious, again, just being really candid, talking to leaders and other people about burnout, because it can feel like a really self-indulgent, millennial created phenomenon. And it brings up this exact boundary of like, it's really dangerous to dismiss it, but it can also be, dangerous to make a mountain out of what sometimes may be a molehill. So it's very complicated.
And maybe it also is shedding a light on something that is also just the state of our scientific community's understanding about mental and psychological science. Like there's a lot of stuff that we don't know versus like we do know a lot about us, like
osteoporosis.
What happens if you have like bone stuff. We actually like know a ton about bone stuff. Yeah. Or blood stuff or certain like there I feel
no, that's 100% true.
My doctor father is cringing listening to me right now.
I was literally just listening to a podcast yesterday that was talking about how the stat that used to be brought up a lot was how we only understand 6% of the human brain. And there's so much that happens that we don't yet have like a perfect name or explanation for. And people are just sort of like working through that in real time rather than dismissing it. But that doesn't mean that it's not valid.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also sort of in, and this is potentially a like projection, so I don't know, but I think it's in a time where we're contending with a lot of societal inequity that sometimes, I worry that sometimes like white folks are like, well, I have a thing too. And I think a lot of them do. But then the question is like, wanting to be on the side of the conversation where it's like, there's a structure that's holding me down as well. And it's not the same, but like participating in the like shouting down the man, which, the in quotes, the man, like I personally feel needs to be shouted down. But that, the question of like, is there a tendency right now to find a thing that you have when some people like actually have a thing that society and social structures and things like that are holding them down? And so like, I don't know that that's actually true. I don't want to project that on everyone, but I wonder about it,
And not to delegitimize anyone's experience, but also I think the argument many would say is again almost one identified by the medical community about triage, which is just like, yes, but is it the most important thing to prioritize right now? Not that it's not happening to you. Maybe and fully it is happening, but that doesn't mean that it is the most urgent thing for all of us.
Yeah. Well, Jess, I think that brings us to your pathology corner.
My pathology corner? Woof.
Your osteoporosis corner.
I don't know why that
Take
was
a Viactive.
Came up to me.
That's how my mom, if I like came home and I told my mom, I was like, Mom, I have osteoporosis. She'd be like, take a Viactive. Deal with it. I used to steal my grandmother's Viactive because they taste like candy.
What is that?
Like a calcium really supplement that's like a chocolate or caramel chew. She just had them in a candy dish so she would eat them. But then I was like, these are candy. So I'm just going to. So my bones are great.
I think we've explored many of the different angles, camps, perspectives around this idea of pathologizing our behaviors, which maybe is experiencing a moment now, or at least it is experiencing a moment in jokes right now, which might indicate that it's something bigger than that. And the traps and pitfalls from any standpoint, whether it's, making certain people feel like they are seen and that they have something that explains things about them that is valid and completely true, but on the other side, does that also delegitimize or deprioritize other urgencies in the world, or put us into some kind of trap where we are equating things that shouldn't be equated with one another? I think it again comes back to whatever experience that you have is probably valid, and you should just keep seeking out. There's nothing wrong with looking for answers, I think, and not being satisfied
100%.
With what you found. I feel like that is a constant.
And seeking what makes you feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And for some people, that's going to be putting a name on it. Or if that, to Joey, to some of your examples, if that makes you feel worse to blame things on a name, definitely don't do that.
Right. Or like,
So
blame
basically,
it
we're
on
just
bread.
saying, like, live your truth in your best life.
And
Pretty
if that
much.
includes like no pizza, then that's like you choose that path
Because you're gluten
Nice.
intolerant?
because you're gluten intolerant.
Sad.
I gave up
That's
pizza
so
for a while
sad.
because I'm lactose intolerant, but then I was like, wait, pizza's still real good without cheese. So now
So
I'm
many
back
options.
on the pizza
Pesto
wagon.
pizza.
Tomato pie.
Wow. Tomato pie. Just only meat. None pizza.
You're just eating pepperoni. You can call it pizza. Well,
You
I think we
know
did it.
pizza, right? It's
No.
just bread with sausage bits, but nothing else. You haven't seen this? Oh my god, this is the funniest thing. It makes me cry.
Well, I think we did it. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by Goblins R Us. Get your trinkets!
As always, we'd like to thank executive producer and Goblin champion Jess Vanta.
I'd
And
also
we'd
I'm not gonna
also
keep-
like to thank our special guest and queen of the Persnickets, Ilana Bondell.
I'd like to thank recreational extraordinaire and sound engineer. Didn't like that. Alex Contel.
And we'd like to thank programming coordinator and musical goblin Les Jacobs.
I have to thank our production help and also 2 more goblins, Nora Mestridge and Sarah Gilbert.
And as always, sorry, Lan.
It's the
Special
weirdest
thanks.
credits we've ever done. Special thanks.
I'm having trouble getting back to my regular voice.
It turned
which also
into
sounds like a
now
goblin.
it's like a southern child who's like
Haunted.
7-year-old
Yeah, it's
child.
old
girl.
Greg's daughter.
I don't know what that is.
You haven't seen I'm old Greg.
I'd like to thank old Greg. Have you
I'll send that
watched
to you.
the new seasons of Great British Bake Off? Great British Baking Show? Noel is old Greg. One of the hosts used to be on a show called
yes.
The Mighty Boosh, where there was like a sketch comedy show, kind of, but it's like surrealist, like very dada weird. And there's a character called Old Greg who like lived in a swamp in a boat. Do you love me?
We mention him on the show time to time. Just for
I'm
fun.
old Greg.
I'm old Greg.
Guys, this is out of control.
Ilana, do you have any
Ilana's like,
special
what?
thanks this week?
Who can I thank other than Joey's vocal cords?
That's true.
I'm getting to use them in our sci-fi D&D show, and it is fun and weird to just make up voices all the time.
Although I have to say, your go-to voice is not dissimilar to your goblin voice.
Is it? Is it?
It's a little higher.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
that
it.
it?
Thanks to goblins.
Thanks
Emerson
to
has
goblins.
2 books that are called Unicorns Are the Worst and Dragons Are the Worst. And the narrator is a little goblin who's just like, why don't goblins get more love? We're special
We
too.
haven't given any kind of shout out to Smeagol.
Well, Smeagol,
Yes.
I guess.
Whom
kind of a goblin, yeah.
I first learned about this winter season.
I know you went through your LOTR awakening.
That's true, which stands for Lord of the Rings. Also, POS stands for piece of S word, which was mentioned
The
earlier.
both of you. Well, prim and proper.
Can I stop recording this?
Yeah, I think that's it.
I think we're
We
done.
love
Bye.
you. Bye.
Can I stop recording? Can I hear everybody else's goblin voices?
I'm a goblin. Hello. I'm just a little guy. I'm coming
You're a
for
baby
your
goblin?
trinkets. Your trinkets and your marbles. Oh, hello.